Right, well, I think we'll make a start. Welcome everybody to this evening's event. I'm Marianne Jump. I'm the archivist at the Marx Memorial Library. Welcome to this book launch of Giles Tremlett's The International Brigades, Fascism, Freedom and the Spanish Civil War, published by Bloomsbury. This will be an in conversation event, and I'll introduce both our speakers properly in just a moment. Very briefly on housekeeping, we'll be recording this evening's session, so just so that you all know that, and we'll be putting it up on the Marx Memorial Library's website afterwards. For that reason, we're asking everyone to keep their mics and cameras off, please. After my brief introduction, I'll be hearing from Giles and Richard, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So what we're doing is we're asking you to please put any questions that you have for our speakers into the chat. We've got an MML person lurking in the chat function, and he'll be funneling questions to myself as chair, and then I'll be able to put them to our speakers, so please do that. I'm just going to open with a few words on behalf of the joint coordinators of this evening's event, the Marx Memorial Library and the International Brigade Memorial Trust. I'll say a little bit about what we do. I was absolutely delighted when the ML was approached by Bloomsbury to host this event. Obviously a bit disappointed we couldn't do it in our wonderful main hall adorned with the banners of the International Brigades. Nevertheless, very, very pleased to be hosting this event. For those of you who don't know so much about us, we are a library, archive and education charity, and our focus is Marxism and the history of socialism. And we were founded actually in 1933, just 3 years before the outbreak of the Civil War, against the backdrop of the rise of fascism in Europe. Indeed, some of our founding members actually joined the International Brigades and made the ultimate sacrifice in the battlefields of Spain, including David Guest, who was one of our earliest lecturers, who was shot at Gandesa, and Ralph Fox as well, who attended one of our founding meetings. But crucially, as many of you know, our library is home to what we call the Spanish Collection, which is an archive of around 150 boxes, which documents the history of the British response to the Spanish Civil War. So the 2,500 who volunteered to fight in the International Brigades, but also the broader Aid Spain movement, which raised funds for medical supplies, cared for refugees, and organised a lot more in solidarity with the Spanish Republic. I'm not just saying this because I'm the archivist, but it's a world-class collection which comprises things like photographs of cave hospitals, banners, correspondence from the front line, sketches from prisons, and minutes, flyers, and lots of printed ephemera. And we're still adding to it today, actually, when from families of brigaders and others involved in related campaigns. And it was only a few years ago that, thanks to funding from the National Archives, we were able to catalogue it in full to a kind of professional standard and get it all up online. And in part for that reason, I'd say about 50% of our researchers who come in to visit us come to look at our Spanish collection specifically. And so there's certainly no waning of interest in the study of this subject at all amongst undergraduate and postgraduate students. Actually, and it's actually how I first came to the library as an undergraduate, looking at the support for the refugee children in Oxfordshire from the Basque Country. But we've also been able to carry out much broader outreach and engagement work with the archive since its cataloguing, including work with local sixth formers and family groups, exhibitions, and much more. But of course, archives like this one really enable this history to be revisited, written and analysed generation after generation. And I'm sure that the work we'll be discussing this evening, this very impressive history, will do exactly the same, bringing many, many more to this subject. The International Brigade Memorial Trust is a long-standing friend of the Marx Memorial Library. It's a charity which works to keep the memory alive, the memory and spirit of the men and women who volunteered to defend democracy and fight fascism in Spain during the Civil War alive. It hosts lectures, supports education work, produces a magazine, and organises memorials and commemorations, and much more. I may have missed something, and I hope Richard will pick me up on that in my introduction to the International Brigades. So it's no surprise, of course, that the IBMT not only have offices at Marx House, but we also have a really strong track record of collaborative working on education and much, much more. I think that's probably enough from me. But so I'm really delighted to welcome Giles Tremlett here this evening, who's contributing editor at The Guardian, fellow of the Cagnard Blanche Centre at the LSE, and crucially, of course, author of this fantastic 700-page new book published by Bloomsbury. Giles is also a member of both the ML and the IBMT, and did, of course, visit our reading room to have a look into some of this history. So really, really delighted that he's here this evening to talk about this book, which is the first English language study of all of the international brigades in over half a century, I understand. Giles is joined this evening by Richard Baxell, who's a historian of the international brigades and who's written a number of books on this subject. He's also a founding member of the IBMT and now acts as its historical consultant. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Over to you two. I'm just going to mute myself now. Thank you.
Okay, I should be now unmuted.
Right, I think I'm on too.
Okay, I can hear you, Giles. Welcome, Giles. Welcome, everybody else. Marion, thank you very much for that introduction. Yeah, I think you've covered everything. Before we go on to talk between ourselves, I just want to make clear that I'm going to ask a few questions, but of course, the likelihood is that lots of you are going to have follow-up questions from things that maybe I didn't ask, or maybe Giles didn't answer, or so if you can put all those questions into the chat, even while we're talking, those are going to be fed through and they will get to us sooner or later. Okay, so perhaps I imagine that this is probably a fairly specialized audience and everybody knows this already, but maybe, Giles, it might be useful just to start off by kind of giving a very brief idea of why we're here tonight, what's so important about the international brigades, who were they, what was their purpose, why were they created?
Okay, I'll just start, if I can, by thanking the library. I remember very well my first visit there many years ago, just as I was starting out on this project, and to the IBMT, and indeed to all the many groups there are around the world who are devoted to digging into the history of the brigades. I always say that often when you're looking at history, you're either looking at documents or you're looking at the work of great historians. But here I found that actually a lot of the work that I've done has involved looking at the work that's been done by groups like the IBMT and the other groups similar to them around the world, in the United States, in France, in Italy, here in Spain. I'm in Madrid, by the way. And so first of all, I really think I just want that to be clear before I start. Who are the international brigades? Well, as Richard has said, I'm sure you all know very well who they are. In 1936, there was a coup, or an attempted coup in Spain against an elected democratic government, a Popular Front government, and that coup was led by the army and supported by right-wing and reactionary elements in Spain, some of them in the church, some of them landowners, and broadly speaking, the middle to upper middle class, or a good part of it. To Spaniards, and I'm here in Spain, and it's very interesting to talk about the brigades to people here in Spain. Of course, the Spaniards, this is a civil war. It's fratricidal. It's about, brother against brother. It's about cousin against cousin. It's about one village or half of one village against another. But I always say that for the brigaders, I think it was a much wider war. They could see already that this was, the beginning of what would then become the Second World War. This is the great clash of the great ideologies of the 20th century, and it really, it starts first here in Spain the reason why 35,000 volunteers from, and it's very difficult to count countries, but from more than 60 of the countries that were around at the time. We have to remember there weren't actually very many sovereign states around then, probably fewer than 80. I've counted more than 80 of today's countries being represented, that they should all come here to fight in what appears like a civil war, but is actually part of a wider war that is just starting between, in very simple terms, we can say fascism and anti-fascism, but obviously there's, you know, complicating factors. There's communism and there's anarchism and all those things that that Spain specializes in particularly.
Sure. So 35,000 people from 60 countries from around the world come to fight in Spain. So how does that begin? How are they organized? How are these people, presumably, well, in fact, we know that a lot of the people, certainly from this country, had never traveled beyond their borders before. It's a slightly different situation, perhaps, when you're talking about Italians or Germans or Italians who are refugees from their particular home countries. But for people in Britain, they've never traveled beyond their hometowns for a lot of them. So how do these people get to Spain? What's the process that they're actually delivered to Spain?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that at the beginning that the brigades are not actually formed until 4 months after the war starts, and so there are volunteers from all around the world in Spain even before the International Brigades are formed. And so we have two things happening at the same time. One, there is a sort of a popular desire, especially across Europe, but also in the Americas, to come to Spain to defend the Spanish Republic, the democracy in that sense, against the reactionary generals. I personally don't call them fascists because that's very specifically an Italian thing, and in many ways I think of them more as sort of Latin American reactionary caudillo types. But anyway, they're in the same broad family, and so many people are already here when the brigades are founded. And in fact, my favorite example is actually from Britain. It's, you know, the small group that travels with John Cornford after he's already been in Spain. He's already fought with the POM in Aragon. He goes back, he recruits a few people, and they come to Spain, and they don't even know that the International Brigades exists when they start off on their journey. So they're genuine volunteers, anti-fascist volunteers, who then discover that the Comintern, and it's certainly the Comintern that is responsible for forming the brigades, is setting up this organization, and that that's the best place to go and fight. The Comintern, obviously, it's based in Moscow. It's communist, but the spirit of the brigade, and it's very specific, and it's very much in the intention of the brigades, is that they are a reflection of the Popular Front, and therefore the whole of the left is welcome. In fact, anybody who describes himself as an anti-fascist is welcome.
Yeah, I do think that's an important point, because there is a widespread belief that the notion of actually volunteering was created by the Comintern or Stalin or the Soviet Union. A lot of people kind of interchange those terms, despite the fact that one shouldn't. But I think you're absolutely right that it is important to stress that there were people in Spain right from the very start. And that was one of the reasons why it was clear that an international group of volunteers would be something that might be possible to help the Republic. Because, of course, they were in pretty dire straits at the start of the Civil War, because it was essentially a military coup. And even if it's a slight myth to talk about it a general's coup, because a lot of generals remain loyal, but the field officers, the sergeants, the people who actually do the fighting, most of them did support the uprising, and those that didn't, it was never quite clear who was loyal and who wasn't. So I think without this foreign army to come in to help the Republic, I think, you know, I very much doubt that Madrid would have been able to hold out. It's impossible to say, counterfactual speculation, but clearly they made a massive difference. Okay, well, maybe we can turn specifically to your book. Probably most people here have read Your Ghost of Spain, which was very successful. I enjoyed it myself, and since then you've written two very well received biographies of Catherine of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. What made you now turn to the International Brigades? Was there a particular reason why you wanted to write about that now, or is this something that you felt was germinating over a number of years and this was your opportunity to write this particular book?
I think it was very much the latter. I'd been ever since I first got interested in Spain and Spanish history 30 years ago. I was, I think, like anybody who started reading about the Spanish Civil War, I was intrigued by the International Brigades, and then when I came to Spain and started working as a reporter, writing for The Guardian and other newspapers, I started to meet them. Occasionally I wrote stories about them, and I started talking to them. But not only that, I also discovered that, that what we think of as a very sort of simple equation, these anti-fascists who come to fight fascism, which we consider to be a very simple version of good and evil, if you want. When you're in Spain, it's not like that at all. And that many people in Spain, certainly in the sort of conservative neighborhood where I live, would view the International Brigade as this sort of evil outfit of dastardly foreigners who came to impose Stalinism on Spain, and that's just a small part of the sort of wider argument in Spain about the Civil War, about Francoism, which I obviously covered in Ghosts of Spain. So to me it was wonderful to come back to the 20th and 21st century and write about not only what happened then, but also to a certain extent, how the brigades are seen these days. So yes, I think it's a desire that was there for a long time. Maybe if I didn't write it before, it's because I felt a certain weight of responsibility.
We all feel that,
because exactly, because of these 35,000, individuals who did something quite remarkable, and also because of the various controversies that surround it, and also because it's just so incredibly complex, with so many different nationalities involved, so many different national stories to understand about what was going on in the 1930s, and then to try and work out how it all meshes together or doesn't mesh together when they arrive in Spain. And that's all incredibly complex, very, very difficult, and but ultimately very satisfying once you sort of start to find your way through the forest.
Sure. Well, Marion said earlier that this is essentially the first book about the brigades in English for 40 years. I guess the previous book in English would be R. Dan Richardson's Comintern Army. So that's a very, very different book to yours and very different book to mine. I guess we both have a different interpretation. How much is this book a riposte to Richardson's idea that the International Brigades were primarily a kind of creation of the Comintern that were there to pursue Stalin's ideology in Spain?
Well, I certainly didn't start out with that intention. It wasn't, I didn't think, this story has to be retold because, there's a bad historian who did a version of it in the 1980s. What I did think was that, a lot has happened since the 1980s.
Sure.
In terms of access to material. You yourself, have been to Moscow, the International Brigades archive. I've been immensely fortunate that appeared online just as I was starting. You know, I remember, you know, my first contact with it was going to the Tamiment Library in New York and scrolling through microfilm, which is, you know, a far more laborious thing than having this sort of glorious, you know, infinite access by the internet, even though, as you and I both know, it sometimes disappears and we wonder whether it'll ever come back again.
Yeah, indeed.
You know, but that is absolutely glorious. And then, you know, I mean, we say there have been no books. Of course, there have been hundreds and hundreds of books. There's a published bibliography here in Spain, which has about, I think, about 2,500 books on the list. They're not all books about the brigades, but they're books in which the brigades are mentioned. And that bibliography is 10 years old, and I could easily add another, you know, 300 or 400 books to it. What we've had is lots of national stories and lots of individual stories. And what we haven't had is the global story.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it was very difficult back in the 1980s and before that to really tell that global story. And we're now in a position where we can, and it's incredibly valuable to sort of I call it increasing the size of the sample, so that you're not just looking at the British brigaders or the American brigaders, but you're actually trying to tell the story of the whole, which immediately becomes much richer and deeper and more complex, and there's really a sort of a mirror of the world as it was at the time. So, you know, there's a lot to add. There are a lot of other archives. I was in an archive in Warsaw. That would have been very difficult to have got to in the 1980s. You know, I've been in Stanford and New York and Amsterdam and various other places. So, you know, there's a lot out there, and there's a lot more. You know, I have to recognize there's a lot more that I haven't got anywhere near. You know, there's much more out there. So, you know, I'm sure there will be room for someone else to come along in, you know, in 10 years' time and do another new version.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. On that idea of there being lots of different archives and lots of different nationalities of volunteers from totally different cultures, how similar did you find the experience of different national units, and how different? I only ask this because a number of years ago, I was part of a project to try and write a book which consisted of lots of chapters on the particular national units. And we found that in the end, actually, the book wasn't that effective because the experiences of all the different groups was so similar. They fought in similar battles, and there just wasn't really enough to tell a story that differentiated them all. Did you find that, or did you find things that were markedly different between the national groups?
Well, I mean, I think there is a lot in common, but I do think there are things that are different, and it has a lot to do with the prehistory of the different nationalities. So, in terms of their just experience of warfare, of course, that's similar. War is war. You know, people are shooting at you, and what's more, you're in the same army, so you're obeying the same set of instructions, following the same tactics. You have the same equipment. So, in that sense, it's not hugely different. And in fact, one of the sort of tragic sort of coincidences about all the kind of national units in the international brigades is that whenever you get a new battalion from a new country, whether it's the Hungarians or the Czechs or the British, or the first thing that new battalion does is rush madly towards the guns and be, I won't say massacred, but, you know, suffer heavily, because there's this sort of initial desire for heroism that isn't tempered by knowledge of warfare, by experience of warfare. But what I do think happens within the units is you start to see, especially where the Communist Party is stronger, you start to see the history of that Communist Party playing out within that nationality of the brigades. Or you start seeing the history of anti-fascism in that country playing out. So it's very different to be a German, where your party has, suffered hugely, you're in exile, and your party moves almost en masse to Spain. I mean, not completely, but a huge part of the party moves here. Or to be an Italian, where fascism has been around for so long that you've been in exile for so long that you've already made the networks with the Republicans, with the communists, with the socialists, with the anarchists, so that you can form a much wider popular front unit. Or to come from Britain, where you don't have that same experience. Maybe you've been at Cable Street, or maybe you've been on the hunger marches or something, but you haven't had that sort of deep experience, which makes them very cohesive, for example, in the Germans, but also very strict and very belligerent. And I do think there are different cultures within the brigades, and you do see the culture clashes appearing in the way people are talking about them. And actually, one of the most extraordinary things I find is that there's a moment where there's a sort of culture clash between the French and the Russians, and they're not talking about the Soviets. They're talking about the white Russians who have arrived and are very sort of actually very Prussian in their sense of what a military culture is. And then you have military cultures as well. And there's a fabulous moment where General Walter, who's a Pole, but whose Red Army wants to tick off Dumont, who's French, and Zurek, who's his adjutant, has to write out the letter, and is thinking, and who's lived in France, and says, no, this isn't going to work. This is terrible. You can't say this to a French officer. And effectively, the whole thing goes badly wrong because they're different military cultures as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's one of the things that maybe people hadn't really picked up on. And it really comes out with looking at the material in Moscow, the Legaspi material. And I remember when James Hopkins wrote his book on the Brits back in I think it was the late 90s it came out. And I had this sense that he'd approached writing about the Spanish Civil War with this idea that there was lots of intellectuals and writers going to Spain. Then he went to Moscow and read all this Legaspi material with talk of desertions and drunkenness. And to be honest, I don't think if you read this book, there's almost a shift halfway through. I don't think he ever really recovers from the experience. But I do think it's important that what this material is allowed, well, you and me and lots of other people to do, is to be able to, I mean, the phrase warts and all is bandied about too much, perhaps. But I think it is important that we now accept that there was a war going on and people aren't always heroic, and things happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that them volunteering to fight and sacrifice their lives wasn't at the same time an astonishingly brave thing to do.
No, of course. I mean, I don't think in history there's ever really been a well-behaved army. Right. And it's simply too much to ask of thousands of men who are going into combat to be well behaved. And I don't mean it's too much to ask them in the moral sense. It's just historically absurd. It's never happened. It's never happened, and it never will happen. So of course there's some bad behavior within the international brigades. There's drunkenness, there's desertions, there's different versions of discipline within the nationalities as well. There's the killing of prisoners happens as well. These no one is a saint in warfare, and I think if we try and paint them as saints, they become literally unbelievable. And and so we need to sort of have that other more tones, more colors in the palette, if you want, when you paint the picture. So I think that's absolutely necessary, because otherwise they just become improbable. And so it's very fascinating. And then I've also found very, very interesting The question of, what happened to the brigaders afterwards.
Yeah.
Some people might have read an essay I wrote in The Guardian about that a couple of weeks ago. And but war, one of the points I've made, and what for me has been a sort of discovery, is this idea that war is very binary. War reduces everything to binary choices. There are only two sides in a war. They might change, and you might suddenly get, you might change sides, but there are only two sides. So you have to decide which side you're on. And neither side is perfect necessarily. And you just have to decide, which one you think is in the right in a binary situation where there is only yes or no,
Assuming you have a choice, of course.
Assuming you have a choice, which of course you don't always have. And a lot of those, Spanish soldiers on both sides did not have a choice.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, one of the things I've only just touched on in the book, and I'd love to write more about. I'm hoping to get a memoir published by a Spanish brigader. The reality of the brigades at the end of their existence is that there are more Spaniards than foreigners in the ranks.
Well, that's neatly brings it back to Spain, because I think, well, I sometimes worry, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody else. I sometimes worry that we talk about this conflict so much in terms of the internationalization, British foreign policy, Soviet foreign policy, German and Italian and intervention, that we sometimes are in danger of forgetting that this was primarily a war that was fought in Spain by Spaniards, and that it was Spaniards that ended up having to live with the tragedy in the way that it bore out in Spain over nearly 40 years. So on that note, I noticed that your book's coming out in Spanish, I think, next week. Is that right?
Indeed, yes. Yeah, on the 19th. Yeah.
So how do Spaniards now see the International Brigades? I mean, clearly there are some people that are utterly opposed, because we all know of memorials that have been destroyed, and yet we also know that there are, whenever I've been to Spain in any IBMT event, it's been packed with people very, very enthusiastic about what the brigaders did and all the sacrifices. But presumably there must also be quite a lot of people who don't take either side. So perhaps you could tell us a bit more about how it's perceived in Spain now, and how do you think that's changing? Because presumably as the generations go on, it will change.
Yes, well, my Twitter feed is a sort of is a fantastic sort of sampling of that. Apart from the odd sort of random Australian who comes in and calls me a communist cockroach. So there are a lot of just the very fact that on the cover of this book, the title of this book contains the word fascism. In Spain is going to be deeply controversial, I know, and in part not just because the full discussion about Francoism and fascism and where they overlap and where they don't overlap and what it means hasn't really been had yet, I don't think. But also because of the belief which, Franco repeated time after time after time, and perhaps one of the victories of the brigaders was that they managed to needle Franco for the whole of his life, because he was continually referring back to them. And indeed, in the inauguration of the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, from where his body was removed recently, he was at it again, saying, oh, we beat those nasty Marxist hordes from the International Brigades. So there is a belief in Spain that the International Brigades were simply Stalin's sort of shock troops who were here to impose communism on Spain, and that was their only mission. That they were entirely controlled from Moscow, etc., etc., which obviously is, completely wrong. but within the memory wars in Spain, and I was able to talk a bit about this at an IBMT meeting a few years back.
Yeah.
They're ongoing in Spain, and I would like to think that with this book I can sort of move the dial a bit and sort of broaden it out so that people can see what's happening in the context. But just as foreigners often don't really think of what the Brigadiers were doing as participating in a civil war, in the Spanish Civil War, which was a very Spanish event in many ways. So Spaniards don't see it as part of the wider global confrontation between the ideologies. They don't see it as this sort of curtain raiser for the Second World War. And so I find myself with the Spanish audience, or I always have to start by explaining that. So controversy surrounds them still. It's going to be fascinating to see how the book is received in Spain. I've written, my last two books were sort of nice, safe subjects about conservative, icons, Isabella of Castile. You couldn't possibly get a more sort of, glorious icon of sort of conservative Spain than that. And I think maybe some people are going to be a little bit shocked to see me coming around the corner now with this book. But, maybe that's actually an advantage, and people will go, well, hang on, he was writing about that, and now he's writing about this. And so maybe in the way that actually Ian Gibson has done very well in Spain, where, people from both sides of the sort of the political divide sort of, show a degree of trust. And I, very much aspire to that. I would aspire to it. I'm not confident I'm going to get it, but we'll see.
Well, I guess that's we'll find out very shortly. But how much pickup are you getting? Are you getting requests for interviews, and is the book being reviewed in Spain?
Well, to tell you the truth, we're only just kicking off the PR side, so I can't really answer that question. All I can say is that I'm pretty confident, and the publisher's pretty confident that everybody's going to be interested. I've written a piece for El Pais's Sunday magazine about women volunteers. So that's going to be, that'll have find a big audience. Some people, some magazines have asked for excerpts. I'm expecting to be quite busy over the next couple of weeks.
Sure.
And we'll see where it goes. I'm as intrigued as anybody else to see, what kind of reaction I'm actually going to get. Right,
great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Giles. I've just had a little nudge that I think Miriam is ready to come in. I know I can see from the chat there's lots and lots of interesting questions. So, Miriam, over to you.
Well, thank you both. You're right, there've been absolutely loads coming through, which is great. So we'll crack on. And actually, just linked to what the article you just mentioned, Giles, we've had a specific question about female volunteers. I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit more about the women who went out to Spain.
So yes, sometimes these things are very hard to count. And just to give a number, my number is about 700, but probably up to 1,000. Of course, the early sort of iconic images of the Spanish Civil War have a lot to do with militia women. There are sort of fantastic photos, some taken, for example, by Gerda Taro, who is, the sort of hidden side of Robert Capa of that byline. And so they're very iconic images, but actually the reality on the ground is that militia women only last for the first few months of the war. And that there's that sort of closed down. You start to see in the socialist press, in the communist press, even in the anarchist press, sort of suggestions, support your man, you know, be at home, and also warnings to men about, you know, the dangers of women who seem to be sort of, you know, carriers of venereal disease and the sort of thing that's going to sort of stop them being true fighters. So there's this sort of pendulum which starts with all these magnificent, and the photographs are absolutely wonderful. I know, because I've been looking at them while we've been sort of preparing this piece for El País magazine, and they're fantastic. And then there are a few examples. There's Fanny Schoonheid is a Dutch woman who becomes a machine gunner. She's actually one of the few people in Barcelona, you know, in July when the militias are being formed, who actually knows how to use a weapon properly, because she's a middle-class girl from Rotterdam who's been taught to use a shotgun and, you know, and go on sporting outings. And then there's another favorite of mine is Mica Echeverher, who's an Argentine who's married to a French Argentine, and they appear in Madrid. And sort of the first days of the counter-revolution, they're sort of wandering around, trying to find weapons, trying to find a group to join. They actually join a poem group which receives some arms, and but the group itself doesn't know what to do with them. And the group includes, you know, prostitutes from the brothel next door. And Mika wrote an absolutely fantastic book about this. They sort of decide that her husband has to be the leader, but he actually dies in August, and she is then, you know, the commander of that unit, and has a wonderful sort of Barney with Cipriano Mera, who's one of the anarchist commanders, who sort of accuses her of being wet and weedy for weeping over some teenage recruit who's about to die, and she sort of comes back with a fantastic riposte, you know, and you like a man, sort of, you know, behaving like a pig. So that's the story of women in the front. Apart from that, you know, there's Evelyn Hutchins, who's the American who, you know, drives ambulances and goes to the front. Gerda Taro is probably the person who actually spends most time at the front. Hemingway is deeply sort of envious of her because she's actually braver than he is. And then there's another whole extraordinary story about the women who are nurses and doctors and translators as well, and that story in itself is fascinating, and also some of the post Spain story of some of those women who then become resistance fighters. There's a Polish woman doctor who becomes very important in Auschwitz, keeping young Jewish women alive who are being used by Mengele and his crowd for experiments. You know, a lot is done, but the truth is that they're just not in the front line.
Yeah, I think there's a particular resonance over here because, of course, the first volunteer to be killed in Spain was Felicia Brown. Yeah, so that was the very first casualty. And I think, as you say, there is a change right from the start when there is militia and there's militia women, and that shifts pretty quickly. And it's actually kind of hard to work out how much of that is just traditional unreconstructed attitudes and how much of it is this kind of terror about how that might be perceived on the front page of the Daily Mail, the blonde Amazon, all the rest of it, because there's certainly the Communist Party is very, very aware that if they stand any chance of winning the war in Spain, they need to gain at least some kind of tacit support from Britain and France, which we know was never likely to be forthcoming. But without the support of Britain and France, it's always going to be an uphill struggle for the Republic, I think.
Yes, yeah. I can see someone on the chat, Gijs Mulder, talking about Yvonne Scholten's book on Fanny Schoonheid or Schoonheid. My apologies, guys. I don't actually know how to pronounce her name properly, but it is actually a fantastic book, and Yvonne has been brilliant in helping me, track down information about her.
Wonderful. We've had a couple of questions about at the end of the war, which I think is would have strengthened your book, Giles. One of them is, what were the reactions of different countries to the brigade members when they returned, which of course were varied? Were any welcomed or punished by their governments?
Well, mostly I have to say the reaction was suspicion. Certainly in Britain, you know, there are huge is it MI5 or MI5 files.
MI5, yeah.
On the brigaders. The Dutch suffered particularly because I seem to recall there was a law against fighting in a foreign army, which meant that you could actually lose your nationality. The Dutch police collected names and held names on files, and some of those files actually fell into Nazi hands when the Germans arrived. So that was very, very bad news. I think probably in France, maybe Belgium, and probably in the Scandinavian countries, you were probably a lot better off. France, simply because the unions were very strong and the Communist Party was strong. Anyway, there was a strong left-wing support base. And in Britain, of course, originally they arrive and there's this sort of wonderful moment where they, march from Victoria Station straight to 10 Downing Street to demand an end to non-intervention. And the other day I was on Michael Portillo's show. He has a radio show now in the Times, and he was saying he wanted to tell me this story about how he'd been at the embankment when the monument there was inaugurated, and how he'd bumped into Ted Heath, and how amazed he was to bump into Ted Heath. And in fact, I was already I stole his thunder a bit, because I said, and you mustn't forget, Ted Heath was actually a fan of the International Brigades. He went and visited them, and so reactions were varied. And of course, a lot of brigaders had nowhere to go. That's why so many of them spent, years in the camps in France, because if you were Italian or German or Polish or Hungarian or Czech, your government didn't want you back anyway. And you can see in the brigade, in the archive, actually, requests to be allowed to go to the Soviet Union, which unfortunately weren't very forthcoming either. Except for the sort of top brass, with good Comintern connections. So it was very difficult being a brigader immediately afterwards. And I always say there's a flip exactly 5 months after the end of the Spanish Civil War, which is the day that Hitler invades Poland, and suddenly everyone is an anti-fascist, and things, start becoming easier after that. Though of course we have to get to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact first, which a lot of people looked at and thought, oh well, they're the same, and a lot of other people said, well, hang on, Soviet Union really couldn't do anything else at that stage, precisely because the democracies, Britain and France, were not going to stand up to Hitler, and they couldn't stand up to him on their own.
Yeah, it's a tricky period until June 1941, really, isn't it? And then everything then there really is a return to the anti-fascist war. Indeed.
Well, there's there's the wonderful moment in where Colonel Fabians, he's known Pierre Georges, who's this sort of, when I think of how old he was, he was 17 when he joined the brigades. They kept him away from the front line because he was so young. He was injured and out by the age of 19. He commanded a unit in the retreats. By 22, he's already been through various camps, escaped, is training, communist guerrilla units, partisan units, and is the first person to kill a German occupier in France. Of course, I like many people always imagined the resistance as being this sort of permanent thing, but no, it wasn't. De Gaulle was shocked when this started happening, and the first two attacks on Germans who were killed in occupied France, they're both carried out by brigaders. And then we get this whole sort of history during the Second World War, brigaders in the resistance, brigaders leading all the partisan armies in Yugoslavia, many of the partisan armies in Italy, and sort of being parachuted into Poland and various other places, and really playing a very important role, which I think has not been sort of properly put together yet. And I think there's some work to be done there.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's also probably true that within the French Maquis, there were probably a lot of, well, in fact, there were definitely a lot of Spanish Republicans. There were a lot of former international brigades from Poland. There were a lot of Jewish former brigaders. So I think on this, there's a lot to be done. I think it's one little story about Fabien is it's nice, what used to be called the Place du Combat, which is where the French Communist Party headquarters is, that basically acted as a kind of central recruiting point. They actually renamed that after Colonel Fabien at the end of the Second World War. So you'll now find what used to be Place du Combat is Place du Colonel Fabien.
And is a metro station.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got quite a few, I can recognise quite a few names in the participant list of relatives of brigaders, and this is a question from one of those. From Eileen, says, my great uncle James McKissock was an early arrival in mid-December 1936, and she asks, how were these early arrivals managed, and how were they kind of slotted into the existing regiment? Like logistically, how did it work, and how was English spoken, because he wouldn't have spoken Spanish at all?
Well, I mean, I'll give a short answer first. Richard can probably answer very well. I mean, in mid-December, he might have been put into the brigade led by General Walter in Lopera. He might have arrived actually too late for that. It would still have been pretty chaotic, frankly, in December. If we think the 1st Brigade was sent off early in November, then they had a couple of weeks before they had to send another brigade to Madrid. You read the reports of the people who are in charge of the training base in Albacete, and they're tearing their hair out because, how can we send these people to war already? We promised we wouldn't do this again. We sent off the 1st Brigade, it was poorly trained. Now we've got to send off another brigade, it's poorly trained. December, things are beginning to change, but it would still have been pretty chaotic and very, very cold.
Yes, and wet, much to their surprise. Yes, so at that stage, if he'd arrived a month later, he would have been channeled straight into the British battalion, who were then training at Madrigueras, just north of the main International Brigade base at Albacete. But because he arrived a lot earlier than that, he joined the English-speaking company, as it was called, which had a lot of Irish volunteers. They were part of the 14th International Brigade. Some had military experience, but many didn't. And their first action was in Lopera, in the southern front of Spain, when they were basically thrown in to try and hold a rebel advance, which they managed to do, and that was famously where John Cornford and Ralph Fox and other volunteers were killed. They were withdrawn fairly quickly from there and then sent back to training, and they were then absorbed into the British battalion. Or there were some Irish who didn't fight with the Brits; they fought with the American Lincolns instead. And I can't remember whether James McKessock fought with the Lincolns or the British battalion. But I think it was last time I had a quick look, and I think he died in the spring of 1937, I think. So he probably would have fought at Jarama, and then I'm not really sure what happened to him after there. I'd have to look that up.
Thanks very much. I've got a question directly related to a recent piece in The Guardian. So I'd like to see if Giles would like to remark on the topic explored in the article, The Contested Legacy of the Anti-Fascist International Brigades, in your recent piece.
Yes, well, I mean, one of the fascinating things to see is, you know, just how opposite some of the views on the International Brigaders are. So I'm in Spain, where we have I've had a long debate about historical memory, and where symbols of Francoism are being taken down, where streets are being that are named after Franco or his generals are being renamed, statues are being removed, etc. But when you go to Poland, you find that the exact opposite is happening, and that the Polish right-wing parties who are in charge now are so deeply anti-communist that anything that had anything to do or any association with communism is considered to be, at least by the government, to be ghastly. And this, of course, is very controversial in Poland, because a lot of Poles remember actually that they were freed from the Nazis by the Russians. But you know, that doesn't wash with the government. So I had a conversation with the Memory Institute in Warsaw about this, and they were, you know, just very belligerently, no, I'm afraid, you know, every brigader was, you know, an agent of Stalinism. Well, I mean, that's not true. It's true in some cases. If you want to see Polish post-war communist regimes as Stalinist, which there's, you know, there's a good argument to be made that you know, that's true or partly true. But if you look at, I have a book here of the written in Polish about the Polish Brigaders, which breaks down their membership in the early days. Half of them don't belong to any party at all, so they're not necessarily communists, and so then you get this sort of division, and things become very problematic when you head on to East Germany. So, I mean, just to set the scene, of course, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union is basically, you know, in charge of the whole of Eastern Europe. It wants to set up friendly regimes. Who can it turn to? Who it knows is going to be, who is sort of tried and tested as an ally? And the answer is the Brigaders in many cases. In some cases because they were already in the Comintern, they were already, you know, trustworthy communist cadres, and in other cases just because they'd proved themselves in battle. And so in East Germany specifically, you get an awful lot of brigaders going into the senior positions in the government, and especially in the armed forces and the security forces. And you get the Stasi, for example, which is founded by Seisser, one of the you know, one of the generals in the commanders in the International Brigades, and then for 30 years, right up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, is run by Merkel, who's another, or Merkel, who's another, who is another brigader. And so you get these sort of individual stories of people who were defending a democracy, defending liberty in Spain, and who then become part of security apparatus. And it will be very difficult to make the argument that the Stasi was a lovely organization. For anybody who thinks that, I would recommend Anna Funder's book, The Stasi Land. And but Merkel himself believes it, and you get this sort of strange situation just after the wall has fallen, where the East German parliament is basically beginning to rebel as well against the government, and Merkel is called in to sort of explain himself, and sort of makes a fool of himself, because he sort of stands up and says, no, I'm a humanitarian, I believe in all these things, you know. And but everybody in East Germany by then knows exactly what the Stasi is. And so, you know, some brigaders, and again, perhaps we go back to the binary nature of things, you know, have, you know, you can say that they play, their role in Spain is heroic, and then their role in East Germany or Poland is not. And maybe the complete opposite. One of my favorite sort of conversations has been with the family of General Lukács of Maite Salka, who's Hungarian, who died in outside Huesca, and was a great hero for the brigaders, was very beloved, and but he had a diary at home which the family burnt because they thought it was dangerous for him and for the rest of the family. The suggestion is that it was full of anti-Stalinist sort of writing. I don't know whether that's true or not. What I do know is it's very comfortable for the family, because they're on the sort of the right side of Hungarian history both times around. They're both anti-fascist and they're anti-communist in a country where which has also turned against communism in a very virulent manner, in the same way that Poland has. So it's fascinating to see the way those things play out in different places. And but you know, the post-war career of brigaders is incredibly varied. And of course, my favorite two examples are British. You know, Jack Jones, head of the TGWU, voted, you know, in an opinion poll, considered to be the most powerful man in Britain in the 1970s. And Sir Alfred Sherman, who is Margaret Thatcher's free markets guru. And, you know, and they're basically, you couldn't get two characters more opposite. Though I have to say, you know, in Sherman's case, he never once repents. He never says that he regrets fighting for the International Brigades. He knows that that was right. He does sort of then go on and say, well, you know, maybe I wasn't aware about, you know, exactly what was going on, the full political, you know, structure, but he certainly has no regrets about that. And I will say just one thing, which I think, which I noticed very strongly, is that very few people regret having fought in Spain, even though many of them later, you know, drift away from left-wing opinions. And even more than that, it's actually the highlight of their lives. And it's something that stays with them. It's the most intense experience they have. It really marks them as people. And that's fascinating as well. I mean, I've been to war as a correspondent, and I can sort of understand how those things happen. So, you know, I know that, you know, every, you know, your one's senses are sort of heightened beyond belief, and everything becomes sort of, you know, dramatic and exaggerated and sort of somehow wonderful. You know, the adrenaline is pumping at, you know, an incredible rate. So that's interesting too.
Yeah, I remember talking to Alfred Sherman when he must have been in his 80s at the time, and it's exactly as you say. You know, he was politically, by then he couldn't be further away from where he'd been as a young 18, 19-year-old, but he still regularly turned up to IBA and then IBMT, or I think must have been around the time the IBMT set up that he died, but he was a regular attender. When I talked to him about it, and it's exactly as you say, he still believed that the International Brigade was a good thing. And if I could just say one thing, I mean, it's not so much about post-war, but it's this, and I come across this a lot with people talking about motivations for going to Spain, and that they went because they were communists, and there's this very simplistic idea that the Communist Party and its membership were this completely monolithic organization. And I know that's not, you don't see it that way, but it's used, it's a bit like Daniel Hannan constantly berating the left as though it's this single unified organization, which of course we know it wasn't. I mean, in this country, for example, many people joined the Communist Party in the 1930s because it was the loudest and most obvious organization that was standing up against fascism. And they didn't necessarily believe in every tenet of the Communist Party, but they felt that it was fighting on the right side. And in fact, you can read documents written by MI5 that come out during the Second World War, when they recognize that there are the Communist Party's got lots of different attitudes, that not everybody thinks the same. And in fact, there was a kind of, if you like, an anti-fascist wing of people who joined late in 35, 36, and people who'd been in the communists much earlier. And they were ruining the fact that they thought that they'd missed an opportunity to kind of put a wedge between those two elements of the Communist Party at the start of the Second World War. So even they recognise that, you know, things are much more complicated than lots of people like to make out.
Yeah, and also it's very easy to actually have a monolithic view of communism as the sort of, you know, the ghastly sort of end of the Cold War communism or Stalinism itself. But actually, if you read Stalin's own his own writing, you know, you can see things which today would sound just perfectly normal to people, about which were then radical. Anti-racism, you know, the constitution that he writes for the Soviet Union on paper is a wonderful thing. It may not have been put into practice, but on paper it's a fantastic thing. And, you know, sometimes when I try to explain to younger people who don't really have much experience of that period or the later period of Soviet communism, that actually, if you go and look at some of the basic beliefs which were seen as incredibly radical at the time, they're things that, you know, that they would take as perfectly normal and would actually be offended by people who didn't believe them.
Quite, yeah. I mean, why do they think people joined the party in the 1930s? They joined almost overwhelmingly because they wanted to make the world a better place.
Yeah. Well, and some joined because they wanted to go to Spain, and that was the easiest way to get there, of course.
That too, yeah. There's many.
So,
there's a number of people who did that.
Yeah.
Sure.
But anyway, and some, but some were, you know, committed Stalinists and would go on to remain committed Stalinists and would behave in the worst possible way that, you know, Stalinism turned out to behave. So, you know, the full range is there. Again, you know, it's you know, saints and sinners. We're not talking about, you know, a monochrome outfit.
Quite.
We've got if it's okay with you both, we've got two more questions. That all right? One of them is asking for a bit more information, because I think you both mentioned the role of Spaniards in the International Brigades, which is often forgotten, and I mean I know very little about as well. Could you expand on that and how that kind of worked?
Well, I mean, in simple terms, I mean, the brigades are, by the end, there are 6 brigades. If you do the maths, let's say each brigade should have 3,000 to 4,000 people. So that's 18,000 to 20,000 people. But they're, you know, by the time you've had a lot of dead and injured, you simply don't have those sorts of numbers. And also there's a huge sort of staff of people in the background who need to keep the brigades running. So basically, it's not so much that they run out of people, I think, as that they expand to a size of which they really just need Spaniards to fill the ranks. And then by the end, you know, in some units, Spaniards are easily a majority. And in fact, they are a majority overall. If you look at the back of the book, you'll see some of the numbers for 1938, and you'll actually see no. There's 55% Spaniards in the International Brigade, and it's a sort of forgotten story. Ironically, you know, some people hated this, and some brigaders, especially the Italians, said, you know, no, this isn't what the International Brigades are about. But others actually said, no, this was actually part of the original idea, was that we should come, form units, become effective fighters, and then teach the Republican Army as well, because we have to remember that the Republican Army had to be formed out of virtually nothing, because most of the regular army had gone over to the other side. There's a lot of history to be done about the Spanish brigaders, and you know, I'm hoping to publish this book. I've got permission from the family, and by someone who actually did a very good translation into English by someone called Fausto Villar, who's a Valencian who fights in the Lincoln Brigade, and is actually one of the last witnesses to, you know, what happened to Merriman, the commander of the brigade, and it's actually a very nice voice. It's very sort of if, like me and Richard, you've read through, you know, dozens or hundreds of different memoirs, you begin to distinguish between people who are sort of too eagerly telling either propaganda or sort of war stories that are slightly sort of sexied up, shall we say, and other people who are sticking very close to the truth and will see shades that others might not see, and this is one example. But there must be a lot more literature out there, and a lot of work needs to be done to find it.
Yeah, I'll just come in there's not much to add to that, but just to say that, I mean, it is true that over the course of the war, the number of recruits for the International Brigades dropped off for obvious reasons. It does have a little rise again in the spring of '38, but then it starts to tail off again. So there are practical reasons why you need to reinforce. But that's only one side of the story. There was also a recognition that when the Spanish Republican Army was reorganized, that if the International Brigades were going to be truly international, then absolutely they had to represent every nation, which included Spain. So there was a direct order that every company had to have a Spanish section, every battalion had to have a Spanish company, and every brigade had to have a Spanish battalion, so that there was more of a mixture and it was more representative. And then gradually the orders that were given to the brigades, initially they were either given in the language of the brigade or they were given in French. But gradually, if you listen and read the memoirs, you'll see orders start to be given in Spanish. So officers towards the end of the war all have to have some element of Spanish, even if it's just being able to say adelante or whatever, or no pasarán, but they need to have some Spanish, which wasn't necessarily the case right at the start.
If I could just add something there, I mean, the brigaders were, you know, exceptional fighters at the beginning of the war in comparative terms, but by the end of the war, they weren't that exceptional compared to the rest of the Republican Army, which had sort of caught up with them. And there are actually some lovely anecdotes, a couple of them in the book, about, you know, when a group of sort of teenage Catalan anarchists turn up and join one of the brigades, and everybody looks at them suspiciously. And then in the Battle of Teruel, they do something sort of mind-boggling, where they sort of run off to rescue a couple of their number who have been sort of isolated and bring them back, even though, you know, they're being ordered not to. And everybody goes, wow, you know, that's amazing. So their own, you know, courage is recognized. Some also desert, of course, which is not so wonderful.
Right, our final question is one of a much longer legacy and more general, from author Lydia Sison. She asks, do you have any sense of differences in the ongoing fictional afterlives of the brigades in literature and films of different countries involved?
Ooh, that's a difficult one, but precisely because well, two things sort of cross there. One is the actual political cultures of the different countries. So you get a lot of literature in Eastern Europe, either histories or sort of historical novels, in which sort of, to begin with, certainly they would sort of follow the model of, I don't know, some of the sort of epic, heroic social reality films where these are these great, you know, socialist heroes who are doing only heroic things. And so they're a bit sort of monochrome, shall we say. And then, in fact, it's quite interesting, with some of those books, you then get a second version, which happens especially amongst the Germans. Kantarowicz is a particularly good example, where he then publishes the real version of his diary, as opposed to the sort of edited version, which was acceptable to the regime. They're not vastly different, frankly, but you can see that sort of, it just becomes a lot more believable when you sort of see these moments of despair and disbelief that start appearing. And then, of course, in the West, well, you get a bit of everything, but generally, again, it's a fairly sort of heroic story from Hemingway in For Whom the Bell Tolls, to a book which I have to admit I'm struggling through at the moment, The Aesthetics of Resistance, by Peter Weiss, which is a great classic of German literature, and is incredibly a difficult reading, I have to say. So there is the idea of of the Brigada as the sort of the embodiment, and I love the title of The Aesthetics of Resistance, actually, of the embodiment of a kind of resistance to other things. But then you get sort of, I think, sort of perhaps I mean, so a lot of people will love the Ken Loach film, what's it called?
Land and Freedom.
Land and Freedom. To me, it was a bit too sort of saccharine, I thought. I need a little bit more sort of dirt in the stories for them to be real and believable. But I have to say, Richard, maybe I haven't come across any brigaders as baddies in literature or in film either.
No, well, I mean, you could argue that Land and Freedom portrays them in that way, because
indeed,
yeah, that's Orwell, I mean that. Yeah. I mean, anything written with a kind of from the Orwell perspective would even if subtly would portray the brigaders as baddies. No, I mean, the only other thing that I'm thinking of that is neutral is that that addition to the literary canon, Biggles in Spain, which is actually, it reflects probably what government, which we know government policy was, or at least officially, which was a plague on both your houses, to say that we don't want, this is essentially fascists and communists fighting it out, we don't want anything to do with it. And Biggles very much takes that line and is very very, very critical about the bombing of cities, which is kind of interesting. But yes, in general, of all the fiction that I can think of that I've read that's involved brigaders, they're all treated very sympathetically. I mean, on occasion you do get them as kind of victims of harsh regimes in the brigades, but that's about as much as it gets. As you say, it does tend to be that the brigaders are painted very sympathetically, and with good reason, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to make the point that that Orwell's literature is totally shaped by his experience in Spain and totally shaped by his experience with the Communist Party in Spain. The sort of the great irony, which I point out in the book, is that if the May punch up in Barcelona had happened 2 weeks later, Orwell had actually gone to Barcelona because he wanted to change from the poem to the International Brigades, and he would have been, metaphorically at least, sitting on the other side of the Ramblas, pointing his gun, at the other people. That said, I mean, Orwell, still said, and he does a review of Summerfield's book where he just tears it to pieces.
Sentimental claptrap.
Sentimental, just complete rubbish. But he does then go on to say, but actually, the International Brigades, are there doing something for us. I don't like the way this guy describes it, but but they are doing something valuable. They are doing something important.
He also recognises that that there is a war on, and that you can't have a revolution in the middle of a war. It's not necessarily going to work. So it's quite interesting. he's painted us something, but it's actually, again, the picture is much more complicated.
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a good way to end the complexity of this whole story. A massive thank you to Giles and to Richard. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion. And to everybody who's logged on this evening, especially those who've been contributing so much in the chat. I think there's quite a lot of reading material that's been mentioned in there as well for us all to be getting on with. Please obviously do buy the book. You'll find the link, I think Marks More Library's account has posted a link to Bloomsbury's website in the chat. And of course, I'm just going to do my bit to encourage you to please join both the MML and the IBMT and find out what we've both got going on by having a look online. I'll be uploading this recording onto the website if you missed the first bit or if you want to re-watch at all. And yeah, thank you all very much.
Good. If I can just echo what Miriam was saying, please do join the MML. Please do join the IBMT. You know, they're both great organisations, and also read the reading list on the side of your screen. It's very interesting.
Yes. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Miriam, for hosting. And Giles, good luck with your book.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for listening to us.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.